to our virtual classroom for our Unit 1 review on scientific foundations of psychology. For our review today, we are going to get started with an introduction to psychology. Here is where we will get a little history lesson on the foundation of psychology and how psychology got to where it is today. Then we're going to take a look at some of the research methods that psychologists and other scientists use while they are conducting research or experiments. We're going to take a look at descriptive research methods as well as experimental research methods and look at the pros and cons of each of these different types of research. Then we're going to move on to statistics in psychology. We're going to take a look at central tendency and get a basic understanding of the importance of statistics in psychology. The last topic for our Unit 1 review is going to be ethical concerns in psychological research. We will look at specific guidelines set in place by the American Psychological Association that are designed to protect participants in psychological research. Oh yeah, and before I forget, make sure you are following along using your review guide. All the information from this video will fit perfectly into the Unit 1 section. When you're finished with the video, make sure you look over the selected response questions as well as the practice FRQs, and be sure to check your work to see how well you did. So before we get started with the history of psychology, we have to understand what psychology is. Today, the agreed upon definition for psychology is going to be the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. But how did we get to this point? A quick history lesson will show us just that. So who's ready for a field trip? Alright, I like your attitude. Let's go. So here we are in ancient Greece, circa 300 BCE. We are currently located in an Athenian agora, or a marketplace. As Grecian citizens go about their daily routines, philosophers such as Aristotle and Plato can be seen discussing their thoughts on the human experience. Aristotle specifically spoke of many topics that psychologists still study today, such as sleep, dreams, the senses, and memory. These ideas presented by Aristotle remained very influential up until the 17th century, with the beginning of modern science. Alright, so we're done with Greece, so who's ready for part 2 of our field trip? Let's go. Bonjour. As you can see, we are currently in 17th century France. It was during this time that French philosopher René Descartes proposed his idea of interactive dualism. Descartes stated cogito ergo sum, which is Latin for I think, therefore I am. Descartes believed that the mind and body were separate entities that interacted with one another to produce our conscious experience, a relationship psychologists still explore today. Philosophers can even be credited with laying the foundation for the nature versus nurture debate, which is still very prominent in psychology today. Another contributing factor to psychology was physiologists' interest in the human brain in the 18th century. By the mid-1800s, it was psychology's time to shine as an academic discipline. German psychologist Wilhelm Wundt used the scientific method to answer philosophical questions about how we as humans experience the world. In 1879, Wundt is going to establish the first psychology lab in the world located in Leipzig, Germany. Wundt and his student Edward Titchener believed that they could follow the same protocol as other scientific disciplines in studying human behavior, with the goal to break down human behavior to specific elements or structures. Structuralists such as Titchener and Wundt used a process known as introspection, where they would, for instance, show an individual a pencil. Then the individual would report the characteristics of that pencil, so the color, the length, the sharpness, smell, maybe even taste. Why not? This was in order to create a total description of their conscious experience. The downfall with structuralism was its reliance on introspection, leading to many of the critics of the approach saying that it's way too subjective for scientific research. Over in the United States, William James was also heavy into research of this new scientific field of psychology. James believed that Titchener and Wundt were focusing on the wrong types of questions. As a result, he proposed the idea of functionalism, which focused on the function or purpose of behavior or act. Several of James' students became notable individuals in the field of psychology. G. Stanley Hall would be the first PhD recipient of psychology in the United States. Mary Whiton Culkin would go to be the first female president of the American Psychological Association. Margaret Floy Washburn would be the first female PhD recipient in the field of psychology and also held the title of president of the American Psychological Association. In 1890, James published his book, The Principle of Psychology, which defined psychology as the science of mental life. Over in Germany around the same time, Sigmund Freud also started to break into the field of psychology. While working at the University of Vienna, Freud analyzed the behaviors of patients with neurological disorders. This is where he saw his colleague, Josef Breuer, relieve a patient's mental symptoms just by talking to them. This led to Freud adapting Breuer's approach to create his own, called free association. This gave Freud the basis for his first published book, The Interpretation of Dreams, where he first uses the term psychoanalysis. The psychoanalytical school of thought believes that all of our behaviors are affected by our unconscious motives. Freud stated that we are not aware of these motives, but we could come to understand them through processes such as free association, dream interpretation, and self-insight. Freud strongly believed that mental issues could be given successful treatment just through the talking cure. The first half of the 20th century will introduce us to behaviorism, a school of psychological thought that focuses on observable behaviors. Our notable individuals with behaviorism are going to be John B. Watson, Ivan Pavlov, and B.F. Skinner. In 1897, Ivan Pavlov published his findings on his studies of digestion. Using dogs, Pavlov found that he could make a connection between a neutral stimulus, which would be a bell, and an unconditioned stimulus of dog food in order to produce a conditioned response of a dog salivating just from a ring of a bell. While Pavlov did not consider himself a psychologist, his work influenced John B. Watson to create the Behavioral School of Psychology in 1913. Today, psychologists follow several different perspectives that stem from the schools of psychological thought we just talked about. Starting with the biological perspective, due to scientific advancements with things such as brain scans and the introduction to psychotropic medications, the biological perspective has been able to shine in the 21st century. The biological perspective is going to focus on studying the physical basis of human behavior. This will include things such as your nervous system, your immune system, your endocrine system, as well as your genetics. Many biological psychologists believe that the mind is what the brain does. From the workings of individuals such as John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner, the behavioral school of psychology has survived over the years. A behavioral psychologist is going to study how behavior is acquired and maintained as a result of environmental consequences. Behavioral psychologists believe that we are a result of what we learn from our environment. Next, we have the cognitive perspective, which is going to focus on our overall thought process. Cognitive psychology has been very popular with psychologists today, both in a research and clinical setting. Cognitive psychologists focus on how we process information and in turn let that information affect our behavior. From the works of Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs and Carl Rogers and his client-centered therapy, the humanistic perspective focuses on people's need to grow psychologically, for them to strive to reach their fullest potential. From the works of Sigmund Freud and the Neo-Freudians, the psychodynamic approach focuses on our childhood experiences as well as our unconscious mind and how those two factors influence our behavior. As world travel became more popular in the later half of the 20th century, psychologists started to recognize how people from different cultures interpret gestures, spoken language, and body language differently. Psychologists then began to study these cultural differences in an attempt to understand, predict, and control behavior, giving us the socio-cultural approach. An offshoot of the biological approach, we have the evolutionary perspective. Based off of Charles Darwin's research, the evolutionary perspective attempts to explain behavior patterns as adaptations naturally selected because they increase reproductive success. So not all perspectives are going to explain every aspect of behavior. So psychologists often adapt multiple approaches in order to compensate. The biopsychosocial approach is exactly what it sounds like. We are looking at biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors, and seeing how they influence our behavior. Psychology can also be broken down into 5 major domains. A good way to remember these domains is by looking at our hand. When thinking, we tap our index finger to our head. This represents the cognitive domain, which is our thought process. Alright, so I never recommend you do this, but if you were to raise your middle finger at someone, this would be considered a bad behavior in many cultures. This could represent our behavioral perspective of psychology, which falls under the developmental domain. Your ring finger is where you wear a wedding band. To most individuals, this might be considered a healthy lifestyle choice, since as humans we are very social creatures. This can be seen as representing the mental and physical health domain of psychology. Next, we have our pinky finger, which is our little baby finger. It was born that way, very short. You can thank our biological blueprints for that, which will reflect the biological domain. Then last, we have the palm of our hand. In many cultures, it's an appropriate greeting to go up and give someone a high five, which could reflect the social and personality domain of psychology. So So the next topic we are going to talk about is research methods, and with that we will touch upon the advantages and disadvantages of choosing different research methods. To start out, it is very important to differentiate between experimental research and descriptive research. Descriptive research is going to be scientific research that involves systematically observing behavior in order to describe the relationship among behaviors and events. Descriptive research is only going to show the relationship between two variables and how strong that relationship is, but it will not show a cause and effect relationship. This type of research answers the who, what, when, and where types of questions in research. Experimental research is going to be a method of investigations used to demonstrate a cause and effect relationship by manipulating different variables. By manipulating one factor thought to produce a change in another factor. Now let's take a look at the different types of descriptive research. Starting with a case study. A case study is going to be an intensive study of a single individual or a small group of individuals, generally over a long period of time. This allows the researcher to compile a large amount of information about an individual or a small group's life. Case studies were used a lot by Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysts. Naturalistic observation is going to be the systematic observation and recording of behaviors as they occur in a natural setting. So if a psychologist wanted to study bullying, he or she may go to a school, sit in the back, and just sort of watch as the students interact with one another. In a naturalistic observation, the researcher does not manipulate any variables. Next, we have surveys, which are going to be one of the most commonly used research methods in psychological research. A survey is just going to be a questionnaire or an interview that is going to be designed to investigate the opinions, behaviors, or characteristics of a particular group. When looking at a survey, there are a few components that we need to know about. The population is going to be the group that you want to study. A sample is just going to be a small portion of that population that represents them. So let's take a look at an example. Let's say you want to do a survey to find out what the approval rating is for the President of the United States. This first circle on the board represents every individual in the world. Do we want to hear from all those people about the approval rating of the President of the United States? Not necessarily. So in this smaller circle, we have every single American citizen. If possible, it would be great if we could have every single person in the U.S. give us their opinion. That would probably be the most accurate results. However, that's a very unrealistic expectation. So what we have to do is look for a random sample that reflects the overall population. Random selection is just going to be how the individuals chosen for the survey were chosen. It's completely random. Everyone in the population has an equal shot at being selected. Next, we're going to talk about correlational studies. Information obtained from naturalistic observations, case studies, and surveys often show us one trait or behavior accompanied by another. We call this a correlation. A correlation can be positive, it can be negative, or there can be no correlation at all. This can be displayed as a correlational coefficient, which is just going to be a number ranging from 0 to 1. A plus sign before your correlational coefficient represents a positive correlation, while a minus sign represents a negative correlation. If a correlation is positive, all that means is that the variables move in the same direction. An example of this could be the more time spent playing violent video games, the more violent behavior someone will exhibit. So as we go up with more time playing video games, we're also going to see an increase in violent behavior. As we go down with violent video games, we see a decrease in violent behavior. Not saying it's true, just a popular correlational study. On the reverse end of that, let's say the more time spent playing video games, the worse our grades get. So the more time we spend playing the video game, the lower our grades. That would be considered a negative correlation because our two variables are moving opposite of one another. The important thing to remember here is that correlation does not equal causation, meaning that a correlational study does not show a cause and effect relationship. If that were the fact, we could have people believing that the increasing divorce rate in Maine is a result of people falling off their fishing boats and drowning. So we just mentioned that descriptive research cannot prove a cause and effect relationship, but what if we want to prove a cause and effect relationship? This is where the experimental method comes into play. As mentioned before, the experimental method is just going to be a research method that demonstrates a cause and effect relationship by purposely manipulating variables. One thing to look out for while conducting an experiment is experimenter bias. This is just where the cognitive biases of a researcher could lead them to influence the results of the study. This could be considered a confounding variable, and it can affect the results of the experiment. When conducting an experiment, the first thing a researcher does is creates their hypothesis, which is basically just an educated guess of the outcome of the experiment. Even if a hypothesis is not proven correct, researchers still learn a lot of information while conducting these experiments. I mentioned earlier that during an experiment, we are manipulating variables. An independent variable is going to be the variable that we are purposefully manipulating in order to produce a change. Our dependent variable is going to be our factor that is observed and measured. The dependent variable is thought to be influenced by the independent variable. While looking at variables, it is very important to operationally define them, or how can we quantify or measure these variables. We also want to make sure we are looking out for confounding variables. These are just different variables that we are not accounting for during our experiment that could influence the results of our experiment. So I'm going to give you guys an example. So my dog Teddy is constantly waking me up at 5:30 a.m. and I hypothesize it's because he gets hungry early because I feed him dinner too early the day before. So now I'm going to try and feed him at different times during the day to see if it affects when he wakes up. The independent variable in this situation could be considered the time that I feed Teddy, while the dependent variable would be the time he wakes up. As the experimenter, I am in control of when I feed Teddy, but I'm not necessarily in control of when he decides to wake up in the morning. I would be able to operationally define my dependent variable by measuring the amount of hours Teddy slept or recording the time that he woke up. A confounding variable in this experiment might be outside noises, such as what if my neighbor's letting her dog out at 5:30 a.m. every morning and when that dog barks to get inside, it just wakes up Teddy. That is something I did not consider going into my experiment, and it could be affecting my results. So when looking at experiments, how exactly are participants going to be selected? When a certain population is chosen for an experiment, it sort of follows the same protocol as a survey. We look at the population and we have to get a sample from that population. Once we have individuals who have signed up for our experiment, we can then randomly assign them roles in the experiment. This just means that if you were selected for an experiment, you have an equal chance of either being in the control group or the experimental group. A control group or a control condition are just individuals who are exposed to every experimental condition except the independent variable, while those in the experimental group or the experimental condition are groups who are exposed to all experimental conditions, including the independent variable. This is in order to compare our results from the experimental group and the control group to see what change is actually occurring. Oftentimes during an experiment, to take away any type of experimenter bias, you will see a double-blind study being done. This is when neither the participant or the researcher interacting with the participants are aware of who is in the experimental group or the control group. When conducting psychological research, it's also very important for this research to be considered valid and reliable. Reliability is just going to be when the experiment produces consistent results when administered repeated times under similar conditions, while validity is when your data and findings truly represent the phenomenon you are claiming to measure. Once research is complete and all the data is compiled, it is important to determine whether or not the results are statistically significant. As a rule, statistically significant results always confirm the hypothesis. If you are not a fan of numbers, I have some bad news for you. I also have some bad news for myself because I also am not a fan of numbers. Regardless, we do have to make sure we understand some aspects of statistics if we want to do well on the AP Psych exam. Fortunately for the AP Psych class, we don't have to dive too deep into statistics to gain an understanding of everything we need to know. Disclaimer, if you have any questions about statistics, please go to your math teacher before coming to me. Thank you so much. Statistics is just going to be a branch of mathematics that is used by researchers in order to organize, interpret, and summarize data. There are two different types of statistics that we are going to take a look at: inferential statistics and descriptive statistics. Inferential statistics are going to be used when we want to compare differences, find statistical significance, or draw conclusions, while descriptive statistics are going to be a mathematical method used to summarize data using correlations and central tendency. For now, we're just going to focus on descriptive statistics. The measure of central tendency is just going to be a single number that represents some information about the center of a frequency distribution. To find the central tendency, all we have to do is to calculate the mean, median, or mode. I'm sure this is just going to be a review for you, but we are going to go through it anyways. The mean is just going to be the average of all numbers after they are added up and divided by the number of values. When you lay your data out from smallest to largest, the median will be the value in the middle. The mode is just going to be the most frequent value in a set of data. When the mean, median, and mode are equal, we have a normal curve. When a curve is a negative skew, we see that it is skewed to the left, which means that most of the scores or values are in the higher range, while a positive skew is going to skew to the right, showing most of our values in the lower range. To make this simple, I will give a quick example. If the College Board released AP exam scores and there was a negative skew, that might mean a lot of people passed the exam, meaning it could have been a little too easy. On the other hand, if we saw a positive skew, that means a lot of people didn't pass the exam, and it may have been designed a little too difficult. This type of information is good because it can tell you how to improve things the next time around. The standard of deviation is going to be a measure of variability, expressed as the square root of the sum of the square deviations around the mean, divided by the number of scores in the distribution. A lot of big words there, so let's try another example to give you a better idea of what I just said. Here on the board, you see that we have a normal distribution from David Weschler's research on intelligence. With this data, we can see that the average IQ score, which a majority of the population falls under, is going to be 100. As we go to the left or right, that number starts to decrease. 50% of the population is above the mean, while the other 50% is below the mean. If we go 2 standard deviations away from the mean, we see that that encompasses 95% of the population. Finding the range is also quite important when measuring variability. To do so is quite simple. It's just the difference between the highest value in a set of data and the lowest value. From elephants being injected with LSD to brainwashing patients to cure what we believe to be considered psychologically ill behaviors, there have been a lot of scientific studies with questionable purposes. To put an end to these unethical experiments, the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research instituted the Belmont Report in 1978. The Belmont Report lays the groundwork for current-day rules and regulations for scientific research involving both human and animal subjects. Today, there are several regulatory agencies that set in place rules and regulations pertaining to scientific research. The Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, or the IACUC, the IACUC, there we go, was designed to protect animals from abuse during experimentation. The IACUC oversees the specific use of animals by formally reviewing animal use protocols and granting approval prior to the work commencing. A local institutional review board, or an IRB, is a group that has been designated to oversee biomedical research involving humans. In accordance with FDA regulations, an institutional review board has the authority to approve, require modifications, or even deny research from happening. This is all in order to protect the rights and welfare of human participants. Federal regulations set in place by the Department of Health and Human Services also regulates tests involving human subjects through the Office of Human Research Protections. On the HHS website, you can find several regulations set in place regarding human testing. The last regulatory agency we are going to talk about, and perhaps the most important for this course, is going to be the APA, or the American Psychological Association. The APA guidelines are as followed. First, we have no harm to the participants. This includes both psychological and physical harm. It is important for psychologists to minimize both psychological and physical risks, all while being concerned for the welfare of the participant. Our second guideline is going to be the importance of voluntary informed consent. Voluntary just means that the participant is willingly agreeing to take part in the experiment, and they know they are allowed to back out of the experiment whenever they like. Informed just means that the participant is aware of any and all risks that may come to them as a result of participating in the experiment. While consent must be unambiguous. Generally speaking, the participant signs a document stating their willingness to participate in the experiment. There are a few exceptions to the consent rule, such as low-risk anonymous surveys, things that take place in a public setting, as well as things that are found on public domain. After testing is completed, it is very critical for the participants to be debriefed, especially if some form of deception was used during the study. For example, with Stanley Milgram's infamous experiment on obedience to authority, he deceived participants to believe that they were delivering a high-voltage shock to another individual, when in fact it was all just pre-recorded voices the participants were actually hearing. At the end of that experiment, with today's APA guidelines, the researchers would have to inform the participant that deception was used during the study, and they would also have to let them know what the real purpose of the study was. Next, it is important for the experimenter to provide results and interpretations to all the participants involved in the study. We also want to make sure that we are maintaining a sense of confidentiality so that in the publication there is no identifying information for any of the participants involved. And lastly, it is very important to accurately describe all of the potential risks to the participants. So those are our APA guidelines. They are very important to follow while conducting psychological research. If researchers today don't follow them, they can actually lose their license to study in their academic field. So that wraps up our Unit 1 review. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys next time for the Unit 2 review. Peace out.